Have you ever realized that you've been saying a common expression or phrase incorrectly, perhaps for quite a long time? A friend of mine recently confessed he'd been using the phrase "for all intensive purposes" for over the course of a school year, until the very last day of school when a student approached him and said, "Mr. C, for all intents and purposes, you should know you've been using that expression incorrectly." In my household, there have been any number of conversations where in the heat of a debate, somebody will say, "Well, you know what? I could care less about." To which I want to reply, "Well, then care less and let's move on." But of course, what they mean is they couldn't care less. It's awkward when we misuse common phrases, isn't it? Like when we tell a coworker they need to nip it in the butt as opposed to nipping it in the bud. One expresses caution, let's get to that early before it's a problem, and the other is just graphic and awkward. Misheard song lyrics are my very favorite of all of these, like the classic Fanny Crosby hymn line, "Gladly the cross I'd bear," which has been misunderstood by a generation of children as "gladly the cross I'd bear." It changes the tone of an altar call really quick, I have to tell you. And even if you're not familiar with hymnody, you should know that no one can hide from these problems. It happens in all genres of music. It was about a decade ago, I was on a road trip with a girlfriend of mine and her 2 teenage sons. The radio was on and we were all bopping and singing along to a Bruno Mars tune when all of a sudden the oldest boy just starts busting up laughing at me. And in an instant, I realized I probably had spent more time in the world of the Bible than the world of pop culture, because instead of singing the actual lyric, "Throw my hand on a blade for you," I was repeatedly belting out, "Throw my head on a plate for you." It's a true story, and it still gets brought up to this day, you can imagine. My point is, these kinds of linguistic errors are known as eggcorns and mondegreens. Did anyone know that? You're lying if you did. Eggcorns and mondegreens. These are words or phrases that we get just close enough to recognize, but far enough off that we miss the intended meaning, and which often causes great embarrassment. How does this kind of mix-up happen? Well, linguistic scientists tell us, those are actual people, linguistic scientists, and they tell us that it's because our minds are constantly trying to make sense of things based on what seems reasonable, familiar, or fitting to our limited context or understanding. This makes sense, right? We all live with biases and assumptions about how the world works based on what we have experienced. And so then we interpret everything through the lenses those experiences have created for us. But the truth is, I think we don't only do this with idioms and song lyrics. I think sometimes we do this with teachings of Jesus as well. That led me to Matthew chapter 5, the beginning of what we've come to know as the Sermon on the Mount, where Matthew tells us Jesus climbs a hillside and begins teaching. Now, I have a lot of questions about the Sermon on the Mount. Like, what mountain specifically was this message preached on? And at what point in Jesus' ministry was it actually preached? We know that Jesus was on a hill somewhere in northern Israel, nearby the Sea of Galilee, early on in his ministry. But if you've ever been to the Sea of Galilee, you know it's a very large body of water and there are many hilltops to choose from. It's a big place. There are debates about whether or not what we now call the Sermon on the Mount was actually one teaching of Jesus, or if Matthew just kind of mashed together a whole bunch of Jesus' lessons in one place in his gospel. So we simply don't know. What we do know is that right from his first words here, it sounds like we might be hearing him backwards. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. What? Didn't you mean blessed are the confident, the influencers, those who win? But you see, Jesus is not offering good advice to us here. He's not listing virtues for us to pursue. Jesus in the Beatitudes is announcing reality. The kingdom of God has come, and it looks very different than what the world tells us it should look like. Maybe you're familiar with the term the upside down kingdom. That idea is connected in a lot of places, but specifically it's connected to the work of a guy named George Eldon Ladd. He was a 20th century theologian who helped us to understand that the kingdom of God is not something far off, but rather a present reality that Jesus inaugurated in his incarnation. He started it when he came to earth. Ladd's work shaped a generation of thinking about the paradoxical nature of God's rule and reign. But here's the thing. While these words seem upside down to us, Jesus isn't turning anything upside down here. He's turning it right side up. The problem isn't with the kingdom, it's with our perception, our earthly perspective. We're the ones living in an upside down world, and Jesus is trying to set it straight here. In the Beatitudes, he's describing what reality looks like when God is in charge. A world when those who mourn are comforted, when the meek have value and worth, when those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are satisfied and filled. And that all feels off to us because we've been conditioned by this world to think of blessing looking like power and performance and perfection. But Jesus says no. Blessing can look like emptiness filled. It can look like grief being comforted and humility being honored. And that's pretty hard for us to comprehend. It requires us to have a fairly dramatic change in our understanding of blessing, does it not? Every one of the Beatitudes begins with that word, blessed or blessed, depending on how you were taught it as a child. But in the Greek, the word there is makarios, and that word means a whole lot more than just happy or good fortuned. That's problematic for some of you because you're sitting there looking at your translation of the Bible and you're saying, wait a minute, Emily, that's what it says here. Happy are the poor in spirit. Happy are those who mourn, and so on and so forth. But most scholars agree that's not a great understanding of what Jesus was trying to communicate here. It's almost inaccessible for us to understand because we have been conditioned to understand happy as something different than what Jesus is actually expressing in this message. Makarios is a deep, enduring well-being, the kind that comes from being in right relationship with God. It's a state of spiritual flourishing and divine approval, regardless of your circumstance. So that word carries the weight of joy and security and favor, not because of anything that you've done, but because of who God is and because of what his kingdom is like. In classical Greek, makarios was used to describe the gods themselves, beings who were believed to live above the struggles and the limitations of ordinary life. And so it's interesting to me that Jesus would use this term because once again, he flips it on its head. He takes that divine term and he applies it to the poor in spirit, to the mourners, the meek, the merciful, the persecuted. It's as if Jesus is saying, the ones the world pities, God calls those people blessed. The ones the world overlooks, God sees and he favors. So when he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, he's not offering a platitude or a motivational slogan. He's making this bold, emphatic declaration. These are the people of this world in whom God's kingdom is already at work. This is divine affirmation in the midst of human vulnerability. And I think this is the key. That word makarios or blessed is not a command. It's not Jesus saying, hey, try and become these things so that you will be blessed. It's a recognition of what already is in the economy of God's grace. When Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, he's saying, even when you feel like you have nothing, the kingdom is yours. Blessed are those who mourn means that your grief doesn't disqualify you from God's presence. In fact, it invites his nearness. Blessed are the meek is a promise that controlled or harnessed power is not weakness. It's actually the path to true inheritance. The problem, though, I think, is that we so easily misread the Beatitudes as a to-do list. This is especially true for us in holiness traditions because we think, oh, I need to become poor in spirit. I need to find something to mourn about. Let's go get persecuted. But these are just attempts to strive further, are they not? They're more attempts to gain what's already been offered to us and what isn't ours to earn, but God's to give. Jesus is not handing out a new set of commandments. He's not sending down new stone tablets to us in the Beatitudes. He's making a pronouncement about his right side up kingdom. They're not aspirational values or imperatives. They're indicatives for you grammarians out there. They're declarations of who is already blessed in the reality of the kingdom. And that is not only paradoxical, it is revolutionary. So as I've been thinking more about this and specifically more about Jesus' life and ministry, I've gotten more and more intrigued that Jesus was not taunted and tried and crucified by the Romans because he claimed to be the Son of God. Frankly, I think they would have just written him off as a loon for that. Jesus was despised in large part because he was proclaiming a kingdom that undermined the very foundations of the existing systems of power and merit and control. And that made people really, really nervous. I think it still does today. Jesus said, you are not what you produce. You are not what you own. You are not defined by your public image. Instead, you're blessed before you do anything. You're loved in your poverty of spirit. You are welcomed even when you feel most unworthy. In the Beatitudes, Jesus redefines everything. He flips an upside down world right side up. Thanks be to God. Now, what does that mean for us here today? Well, for starters, I think it means we have to unlearn what we think we know. That is not easy to do, I can assure you. Because it means that the path of blessing may take us through the valley of mourning, through places of powerlessness, through terrains of longing and mercy and peacemaking and even persecution. And I know some of you already know that far too well. But the Beatitudes were never just a message for that first century crowd on the hillside. They are Jesus' voice breaking into this very moment today. The Sermon on the Mount is not just sacred history, it is our present reality, here and now. What if Jesus is still climbing hills? Not necessarily in Galilee, but hills of anxiety and burnout and injustice and fractured communities. What if he's still proclaiming blessings over those who feel forgotten and disqualified and small? What if Jesus is saying, blessed are the ones overwhelmed by the chaos of their news feeds because they still hunger and thirst for righteousness? Blessed are the weary parents, the silent sufferers, the overworked, the unseen, because God still sees them. And the kingdom is theirs. Blessed are the refugees, the prisoners, the addicts, the doubters, because grace isn't for the polished, it's for the desperate. Blessed are those who are done performing, done pretending, done chasing the approval of this world, because they finally are ready to receive what only King Jesus can give. Jesus is turning the world right side up here, friends, not through power or platform, but through ordinary people who believe that emptiness can be sacred and mourning can be holy and meekness can be strength. That's not just a beautiful paradox. That's a calling. The kingdom is not some future ideal we're waiting to inherit. It is a present reality that we are invited to participate in here and now, today, right where we are. And the world may call that foolish, frankly, but the kingdom calls it blessed, and the King calls us forward into it. We need to listen, and we need to hear again, not just what Jesus said, but what he truly meant in these words. And so I'm really grateful because for the next 8 weeks, we're going to dive into the Beatitudes, into these paradoxes that Jesus offers so that we might better understand the realities of his kingdom that is here and now, as well as breaking through. And as we've been getting ready for this series, I've been wondering, God, what would it look like if College Church could listen again to these teachings of Jesus and rightly hear and embrace them? How would we differently understand our status as a blessed people? How would we then live differently because of it? And how would we as a church and a community be different and more like Christ if we understood the Beatitudes as evidence of Christ's kingdom now, instead of it being a list of commands or a to-do list that we need to accomplish before we're dead? I want to challenge us together to listen again, to read again. I mean, it's a crazy idea, but I thought, what if everybody in this room were to commit to reading these 12 verses every day over the course of the next week, 8 weeks? What would happen? How would God open our eyes and our ears and our hearts and our minds anew to what Jesus is really saying? I think we might be surprised. Surprised that what might sound like weakness is the way of strength. That what may feel like losing is actually gaining, and what might sound like foolishness is also the wisdom of God. Maybe we've been mishearing or misunderstanding Jesus all along, not because his words were unclear, but because we've been using the filter of this world to receive them. I love Eugene Peter's translation of the Beatitudes, and so to close this morning, I want to invite you, you could take a posture of prayer or whatever it is that helps you to hear the word of God. But hear again the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5. Jesus said, "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be bought. You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He is food and drink in the best meal you'll ever eat. You're blessed when you care. At the moment of being careful, you find yourself cared for. You're blessed when you get your inside world, your heart and your mind put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. That's when you discover who you really are and your place in the family of God. You're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. That persecution drives you deeper into the kingdom. Not only that, count yourselves blessed every time people put you down or throw you out or speak lies about you to discredit me. What it means is that the truth is too close for comfort and they are uncomfortable. You can be glad when that happens. Give a cheer even, for though they don't like it, I do. And all of heaven applauds. The Beatitudes are signs of the right side up kingdom, a kind of holy mondegreen, if you will. They may sound strange to our ears that have been trained by the world, but if we listen carefully, if we read them again and again, I think we will find them to be exactly what Jesus intended them to be: transformational. So I'm going to pray that we will lean in, that we will listen closely, that we will embrace these paradoxes anew and trust that the kingdom of God belongs not to the perfect or the proud or the polished, but to the poor in spirit, to the mourners, to the meek, to us all. Thanks be to God.